reliability, which would result in vastly improved outcomes. And the theory behind what they were looking at is they wanted to enhance the teamwork and communication, especially bringing in multidisciplinary teams together. And they focused, especially, they didn't focus on all areas. They focused on areas of great harm and where the evidence base was quite strong. This is how they started. They identified around 6 main areas, and they used this checklist, which is a ICU adverse event trigger tool, and they identified 6 important areas. And they reviewed around 35 years of literature related to critical care, and they came out with the IHI ventilator bundle and IHI central line bundle. I've just highlighted something in the red circle. Fifth bundle called daily oral care with chlorhexidine was added in 2020, which says that care bundles have to be continuously re-evaluated and added. So what they did was, this is an important concept that they introduced by the IHI, all or none measurement. They measured the compliance of these 2 bundles by checking documentation of adherence to all elements of the bundle. If you see the previous slide, it had around 4 elements, and in the central line bundle, it had 5 elements. So they measured the adherence to all elements of the bundle, and this technique is called as all or none measurement, which focused attention on the importance of delivering the bundle together, not as individual elements. This is all or none measurement. And what did they come out? What did they predict? Most clinicians, they thought that, that it would be rendered reliably or performed well. But to their knowledge, it was found that there was only 10 to 20% of compliance. So, they were checking on what happened, and this increased the motivation to change the process in their critical care units. So what did they do? They focused on teamwork and communication, not just only on the elements, so that there would be consistent care to improve compliance rates. And the process redesigning was done, redesigning and implementation was done. And there were several months took before they could reach this all or none compliance. And at the end, they were surprised to observe there was a decrease in VAP, and they also observed there was a decrease in CLA BSI. And these reductions in the incidence helped them to develop and refine the bundle concept further. This is how it all started. And the 2 elements of success that were identified in the initial project was, the participating clinicians agreed that there was sufficient medical evidence. The evidence was agreed by all the clinicians. And the second element is the small number of elements, not exceeding 5. And these were the elements of success. So the messages learned is, it is not intended for comprehensive care, but rather when compliance is measured for a core set of accepted elements of care for a clinical purpose, the necessary teamwork and cooperation required will result in high levels of sustained performance. That is reliability, which was not observed when work improve the individual elements of the bundle. That was the message learned. So, the next bit that we are going to discuss is the bundle design guidelines. There are 6 guidelines. The first one is the bundle has to have 3 to 5 interventions with strong clinical agreement. And the second is each bundle is relatively independent. The third is the bundle is used as for a defined patient population in one location. The multidisciplinary care team develops the bundle. Bundle elements should be descriptive rather than prescriptive, and the compliance is measured based on all or none measurement. We'll just quickly go through what does that mean.
Now it's correct.
Hello, am I audible? Hello, hello, hello.
You're audible.
Ma'am, you're audible, ma'am.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, there was some disturbance in between. The bundle has 3 to 5 interventions with strong clinician agreement. What does this mean? It is all taken from the reviewed literature or national guidelines. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, why is this clinician agreement is very important, so that we don't spend time debating the validity of the elements. And the third thing is, why do we need to have 3 to 5 interventions, is that more number of interventions makes it mathematically more difficult to achieve high compliance. And these are the reasons why there should be only 3 to 5 interventions with strong clinician agreement. And the second element is, it is relatively independent. Each element is relatively independent. What does that mean? The bundle is designed so that if one of the elements of care is not implemented for a patient, it should not affect whether other bundle elements are implemented. Say, for example, if it's going to be a VAP and or central line bundle, if the insertion site was not cleansed with chlorhexidine, the remaining 4 central line bundle elements still could be practiced. That is what it means by relatively independent. And the third element is, it is for a defined population in one location. The bundle, usually when it is developed, it is for a single population group. Say, for example, it is for a patient who are with, mechanically ventilated, or those who are on indwelling catheter. That's what it means. So if one type of harm is happening in more than one place, okay, so you need to go for a bundle for each location. And that is how there are 2 sepsis bundle for sepsis. One for management of septic patients in the emergency department, and another for the patients in the ICU. So it definitely needs to be for defined population in one location. And the next is the multidisciplinary care. So this I've already highlighted. Communication and teamwork is the fundamental. And bundle element should be descriptive rather than prescriptive. What does that mean? It means that generally accepted opinion may support a given element, but the care element should be implemented in several ways, according to the local, whatever resources are available. For example, the DVT and PUD prophylaxis for a ventilator bundle do not specify the type of prophylaxis, what kind of, PUD medications have to be given. That is not specified. So local clinicians will determine the appropriate form. So that is what it means here. It should be descriptive rather than prescriptive. And the next is, compliance with bundles is measured using all or none measurement with a goal of 95%. So the compliance is taken as good only if it is more than 95%. And usually if all the elements are done together, we consider it as it is done. Even if one element is missed out, we say it is not done. If it is missed out, like say, for example, I'm not able to raise the head end of the patient to 30 to 45 degree in VAP, I should be able to clearly indicate in the document why it is done. Then it is considered that it is performed. Otherwise, it is considered as not performed, and the whole bundle is considered as not performed. There are no partial credits that is given for this particular measurement. So that is called as all or none measurement, and 95% is important. So these are the summary of key bundle elements. Group of 3 to 5 evidence-based interventions, and each intervention should be widely accepted as a good practice, should be adhered to for every 100 patient 100% of the time, can be used to measure evidence-based practice, and it can be audited, and audit focused on organizational aspects, and only compliant with bundle when every intervention is completed or a step is excluded for predefined reason. So what makes a bundle so special is the holistic principle behind. And that is why we call it as a bundle, because with a holistic principle, there is complete consistency, and a bundle ties the changes together into package of interventions that people know must be followed for every patient every single time. And the next one thing we have to remember is bundles are not checklists. If you see the differences, bundles consist of only critical tasks, not all the tasks. Task must be evidence-based and limited number of elements, and it's tied to accountability. Whereas in contrast, checklist, it is mixture of nice to do and have to do tasks, and not necessarily evidence-based, and there are many elements, and no one group or person is held accountable. So what is the goal behind bundle of care? To help healthcare providers more reliably deliver the best possible care for patients undergoing particular treatment with inherent risk. It could be, like a particular group of patients or a particular population with some risk. As we say, mechanically ventilated patients with ventilator-associated pneumonia. What are the benefits? It is, like better care, direct benefit to the patient, The first and foremost important is less variation in care among caregivers, where knowledge for improvement is already available. So there is, when you have a bundle, everyone is expected to perform in that way. So there is less variation, shorter intensive care unit stay, reduced financial cost, more predictable health outcomes, less waste and inefficiency, leading fewer delays in diagnosis, treatment, and fewer complications. Next, I'm moving on to the development of a care bundle. These are the theoretical steps. I've given the reference then and there. You can just check it on. The first step is identify problems or risk in a specific population. The second is the identify care problems or risk should be clearly defined. And third is to conduct a literature search to collect relevant evidence. Fourth is select potential relevant and feasible elements from the literature search. Select a final set of maximally 5 elements, create a care bundle in draft form and pilot test. These are the steps and we'll go into each of the steps. And remember, care bundle developmental process is more or less very similar to EBP process, that is evidence-based practice process. And this is the evidence-based process that we follow. Ask, acquire, appraise, apply, and act. So before we start with the care bundle development, formation of a team is highly important in the development as well as in the implementation. And these are the core competencies. Any member who is selected should be are in providing direct patient care, working in interdisciplinary teams, willing to employ evidence-based practice, will be able to apply quality improvement methods and utilizing informatics. These are certain competences that have to be kept in mind while choosing the team member. And why do we assemble a team of interdisciplinary providers? Because when they come together, we get a lot of knowledge. And the team members and disciplines are determined by the topic. And the breadth of knowledge will lead to discovery and possible application of research findings. And when comprising the team, consider the question who should be involved with monitoring quality patient care. And if we have an existing structure already, we can build on that, or we have to build the new structures. And I've quoted examples of team for different care bundles from 2 different review. One is, when they were trying to form a bundle for obstetric anal sphincter injury prevention bundle, which was a nationwide initiative in UK. They had experts from Royal College of Midwives, Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And there was one more team which was built to improve the compliance with sepsis bundle, especially in the ED. There they had quality department director, sepsis data coordinator, emergency department clinical nurse specialist, and ED clinical nurse champion, ED physician, ICU medical director, and ED pharmacist. So the team will differ based on what type of bundle you are developing. So these are the base for my presentation. I took from a systematic review which developed a flow chart for building evidence-based care bundles. And these are from the review. There are different bundles that have been developed. Okay, there are a few examples that I've listed apart from septic care bundles, ventilator, or surgical site infections. There are bundle of external cerebral ventricular drainage, ventriculostomy placement bundle. There is palliative and whatnot. There are a lot of other bundles even in other specialties. So the first step is identify problems or risk for a specific population. How do I go about doing this? First thing is I need to assess my practice. Is there a burning question within me regarding the practice? Am I curious about something, why this is done this way, why it can't be done in some other way? So I need to assess my practice and start for looking something in the practice that could be done better. And what is the clinical concern or what is the uncertainty? So doing this will help us to come out with the problem, and the people who are close to patients will be able to do this better. And there are certain triggers to create the clinical questions, and I have taken this from the Iowa EBP model. There are problem-focused triggers and the knowledge-focused triggers. The problem-focused triggers comes from the clinical area, where it is from the risk management data, process improvement data, internal and external benchmarking data, financial data, and identification of clinical problem. And the knowledge-focused triggers come from the research, guidelines, standards, philosophies of care. If you see here, I've just put a picture where the infection and fall rate have been compared with the benchmarking data. They had a benchmarking hospital and they have found, they have compared it with the benchmarking hospital. So this will help us to say what is our priority. And I've given it from the review, the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. They did a systematic review to find out the problems, and they used the adverse events trigger tool. And in yet another study, they have used analyzing their own patient clinical data. And a study from Saudi Arabia, they did a root cause analysis. And from USA, they did something called as FEMA, which is also an RCA, a part of RCA, failure mode and effective analysis. So this is yet another, adverse event, different types of adverse event tools to find out the problems in your area. So, I'm just going to keep explaining with one example. Imagine that I've used clinical data on the incidence of hospital-acquired infection, and I've come out with the most important problem as ventilator-associated pneumonia. The second step is clearly define the identify care problem. See, once when the problem is identified, I need to define. So usually it can be done with a comprehensive literature search strategy. But the other things that could be done is I have to define, operationally define for my population, the incidence, the risk factors, the knowledge lacunae, the skill lacunae, the resource lacunae, and the outcome indicators. And I can also use the Picard format. Okay, so this is again from EBP. I should say who is the population affected and what is the intervention that I'm looking for, what I want to compare with, what is the outcome of interest. And this will help to define the problem, and this will help in literature search. So the example is continuing. If you see, I told you the VAP is a problem. So I give the incidence and I give the risk factors and I give the mortality, say like 46% compared to 32% who did not develop VAP. And I also give what are the disadvantages of having VAP. So this is how you go about defining the problem and decide. Once when you have this, you need to decide whether it's going to be a high risk or a high volume problem, and what are the changes in the outcomes, and will you be able to gain interdisciplinary support, and are others interested and excited about the topic. Getting the team members' cooperation is something very crucial here. And the next thing is I should be able to sell the clinical issue. I know that I have a problem here. I wanted to change the practice, and I should be able to say what are the costs that is attached, and what is the data that I have to tell others, and what are the cost implications. I need to have all this data if I have to sell the clinical issue, and data need to be presented to the right people in an understandable format. You can use a chart, you can use a bar graph, you can use a pie, whatever it is, so that people understand it and they give their support. So once when you have defined that, the third step is conduct a literature search. And how do I search? That's what we are going to see in, see, I've given a 5S model of evidence where it's from the apex, it starts from the systems to studies. Systems is already, like it is all meta-analyzed, and they come out with the computerized decision support. And summaries are critically appraised topics, and they come out with evidence-based guidelines. Synopsis, critically appraised, evidence-based journal articles. And synthesis are with the meta-analysis and systematic reviews, and we call this as secondary pre-appraised research. Already the research that has been done is already evaluated, and they have come out with the evidence. And the studies refers to the primary original research, where we have the RCTs, cohort studies, case control studies. And the second, this picture tells you what are the different electronic databases that are available. Say for computerized decision support software, there is a software and we have the NICE guidelines. And for summaries, we have Dynamite, we have Essential Evidence National Guideline Clearinghouse, and a lot of practice guidelines. For synapses, we have a lot of journals available. And for synthesis, which is especially for systematic reviews, we have the Cochrane database, we have the TRIP database. And for the studies, we have a lot of websites like PubMed, we have CINAHL. So we go into this and we look for the review. And these are again, like the electronic database. And I've given it again in the tabular form. What are the different databases that are available for our literature search? This is an example of the TRIP database, translation of research into practice, where you get for systematic reviews, evidence-based synopsis, clinical guidelines, and the regulatory guidelines. So once when we have done this, okay, I'm just saying it in few words, but this is not that easy. You need to get the help of a medical librarian if you're not confident of doing it. And there are a lot of courses also on this. So once when I have done the literature search and I have pulled it out, what is important for my problem, I should be able to select potential relevant and feasible elements from the literature search. So you can choose as many as possible interventions for the selected theme. Remember, it has to be relevant, feasible, practical, and reliable. And one important key is critical appraisal of the reviewed literature. What do you mean by a critical appraisal of the reviewed literature is, I go through their aim, the research methodology, and I check whether the results are valid. And that is what I call it as, and I grade the evidence. That is what I do it in critical appraisal. And if you see here, I've just put under a red circle, there are a lot of tools available for critical appraisal. And I think, you know, we are quite used with CASP checklist, which we call it as critical appraisal skills program, agree and grade. There are a lot of things, and based on the type of study that you have taken, the tool will differ. And again, this is yet another slide which talks about the different tools. See, in the critical appraisal skills program, which we call it as CASP, we have three. They just look at three things. Are the results of the review valid? What are the results? And what will the results help locally? These are the three areas that they check on. And you have for different types of studies, the CASP checklist. And this is yet another checklist that I've taken right from the aim till the whether the results will be applied locally is checked, and they grade the evidence. See, they have taken the different studies, they have different questions framed, and then at the end, they will tell what is the study quality, whether it is high, moderate, and how do I grade the evidence? So there are 5 steps, especially in the grade scale. Which outcomes are critical to a decision, the quality of evidence, the overall quality of evidence, the balance between benefits and harms, and the strength of recommendations. I'll just skip that slide. Grade the evidence, whether the evidence is going to be high quality, moderate quality, low quality, or very low quality. And this is the same thing. Please remember, the quality of research is equal to quality of evidence. If the research has not been conducted methodologically or sound, the quality of evidence is also going to be affected. And this is the levels of evidence that we are looking for. Okay, level 1 evidence is the best evidence, and level 7 is the least evidence. So level 11 evidence comes from systematic review, and level 2 comes from at least one well-designed randomized controlled trial. And that is what we are looking for in the care bundle. At least if I don't have a systematic review evidence, at least I want an evidence from an RCT, well-designed RCT. That is what we are looking for in bundle development when I wanted to choose the element. And the 5th step is select a set of maximally 5 elements. So keep the bundle elements in mind. Level 1 evidence, 3 to 5 elements, just keep that in mind. And in the IHI, which gave the history for care bundles, they use the grade approach, okay, which we saw. The tool that they use for choosing the element is the grade approach. See, when I choose an element, it is an evidence-based decision, but I also need to balance the literature. I can't just take it from the literature. I need to look whether it has got evidence-based, and I need to look for clinical expertise, and whether it is going to be applicable to my clinical context. Are the health resources available? Will the patient accept? So these are some areas that I have to keep in mind when I'm choosing the element. So with the example, if you see selection of 3 to 5 elements, VAP, they selected the 4 elements. I'm not going into the depth because Sheila will be dealing with that. Like when you choose that, each of the area, say head of the bed, 30 to 45 degree angle, it has to be elevated. I need to collect all the studies related to this particular element. And, I need to check with the randomized control trials. Here they have taken 88 intubated patients, and they checked. Suspected VAP in semi-recommend position, it was 8%, but whereas In a supine position, it was 34%, and confirmed VAP, it is 5%, and here it is when they put the patient in 23, meaning supine, it was 23%. So you need to get evidence like this. You need to, like critically appraise these review, and then, you need to grade the evidence. Only then you can choose the element. And once when you choose the element, create the care bundle in draft form. Okay, so before you put it in writing, you make sure that you have kept the bundle elements in mind, agreement has been reached among the experts, and local application is kept in mind. Then you go in for the pilot test. Pilot test, it's like a small mini scale project. We all know this. Define the project plan, define the protocol, specify the process as well as the outcome measures, because implementing a bundle is a process, but their outcome measures, again, you need to tell. Determine the method for data collection, implement process, and you need to draw conclusion whether you're going to adopt, reject, or modify. And I put a picture there. It is a continuous cycle. It's from the management. You would have learned it in management. And we usually go in for a PDSA cycle. P, plan, establish a team. Why are we changing, and what are we changing, and how are we going to do it? So you come out with a plan. When you are doing it, we initiate a change. And the study is, what are the things that I'm going to measure? What are the process measures that I'm going to measure? And what is the outcome measure that I'm going to monitor? And then you decide based on the analysis whether you're going to implement or you're going for further improvement. This is again a model for improvement, which is quite often used by the IHI. So this is a wonderful example for the OSI care bundle, as I already talked. Okay, they beautifully planned. It's a nationwide initiative that they took. In May 2014, they found that there was an increase in obstetric anal sphincter injury through a review, and they formed in October 2014. They formed a group, team members from RCM, RCOG, and the OSI care bundle group discusses the evidence and acceptability and feasibility of each identified intervention. There were around 5 interventions in the bundle, and March 2015, the OSI care bundle group participates in a consensus meeting to agree on the elements. Pilot studied in January 2016, and May 2016, funding obtained from the Health Foundation to upscale, to put it into practice. This is just an example that I had taken from a review. When I want to, okay, this is again from, I've taken it from AHRQ, Agency for Health Research and Quality. There are strategies. How do I put my bundle into implementation? Is easy to remember. Engage, get the team, whoever is going to be involved, get their support. Educate, teach your team. Execute, then implement your plan, and then evaluate. And in terms of education, you underestimate what your staff know about this particular bundle. Then go ahead. So you can conduct in-services, you can conduct forums, orientation, and you can bring in and show in the evidence, provide staff with evidence like fact sheets, literature reviews, and use a board to display infection stories. This is just, they have done for an SSI. So infection stories, goals and facts, and team successes in areas. So this is again from the OSI bundle that I've taken. They brought out a theory of change. If you see here, when they wanted to implement, they came out with a care bundle manual. They came out with the support from project team and professors. So when the care bundle was brought in, the clinician support was got. Clinicians are receptive to change and willing. And they brought something called as local champions. Initially, they trained few people from the clinical area, and those trainers were trained to train the other staff. Okay, they were given incentives and support, and the support from the project team, it was got, and ongoing cooperation and support of professional organization was got. And since this is with the antenatal mothers, the mothers were given information, and their support also was got. This is again with the VAP bundle. What are the different methodologies they followed to implement? One is they included the, head and elevation in the nursing flow sheets. They brought it as a topic at multidisciplinary rounds, whether it is followed. They used respiratory therapists as team members, and they involved families. Whenever the head end of the bed was not elevated, they were expected to inform the clinician or the nurse. And they used visual cues near the bedside, whether it is elevated, put a mark at 30 degree, and they put this intervention on order sets whenever the patient was initiated on mechanical ventilator, weaned off a ventilator, or delivery of tube feedings, and they posted the compliance report in the ICU to encourage change and motivate staff. So once, when you implement, audit and monitoring is very important. Both the process and outcomes have to be monitored. Monitoring compliance is a process, short-term measure to evaluate the effectiveness of the bundle, and compliance is depicted as run charts on daily basis. Audit, its compliance is compared with traditional outcomes like the incidence of VAP, ventilator days, the mortality, the length of hospital ICU stay, and so on. This is an example for care bundle compliance example of run chart. If you see the 4 elements put there, and day 1, day 2 for different 4 patients, whether it is done or not done. This is what we call it as a compliance run chart. And these are examples for audit reports where the compliance is compared with the ventilator associated pneumonia. And you can see as the compliance improved, the VAP decreased. And this is yet another example for central line insertion bundle. And you need to check the reliability, whether when the bundle elements are done, what is the reliability? Whether when the unchanged, there is a reduction of VAP in 22%. When the compliance was less than 95%, it was 40% of VAP, and more than 95%, it was 61% of reduction in VAP rate. So these kind of studies are very important to keep you motivated and go ahead. And one another important thing when we are implementing is barrier identification and mitigation. This again is taken from AHRQ. So you need to have a BIM team, identify the barriers, summarize the barrier information, prioritize barriers based on impact and feasibility, and you need to develop an action plan. Only then your bundle bundle implementation is going to be effective. So I've just given in 3 areas. All these are well validated ones. So clinician or whoever is the healthcare professional, their attitudes, their knowledge, behavior, and compliance could be a barrier. So that has to be assessed. And in terms of environment, the task, the tools and technology, the administrative support, the performance monitoring and feedback. I put as a perioperative culture because this is done for an SSI, so surgical site infection, and guidelines. What is the applicability and the ease of compliance? So barriers have to be assessed in terms of all this. And there are checklists that are available for the clinicians and for the work environment. And then you summarize and prioritize the barriers. You have a likelihood score and a severity score. So you get a barrier priority score. You grade it. You say which is the top priority barrier, so that you'll be able to assess that and you'll be able to deal with that first. And then you go ahead with the bundle development, bundle implementation. So far, we have discussed what is the definition of a bundle and how to develop and how to implement and what could be the barriers. So what would be the take-home message? The use of bundles of care intervention is an approach to improve the reliability of care received by patients and preventing certain serious clinical outcomes. And remember, the success is related to more than simply doing a bundle. What is the key? That is, like the teamwork and the communication and the collaboration is something very, very important, because each element is put together into a bundle, and implementing a bundle with high reliability requires redesigning of work process, communication strategies, infrastructure, along with sustained measurement and vigilance. And please remember, bundles are neither magic bullets nor comprehensive care for any condition or patient situation. We are not, looking for a comprehensive, if I say ventilated patient, I'm not looking for a comprehensive care for a ventilated patient. I am taking something that is evidence-based, which is very small, and I'm trying to improve certain things. Rather, they are one strategy among many that hospitals must implement so that they'll be able to help the patients go out of ICU or to have a quality nursing care. So whenever you are implementing a bundle, please ask these questions. Do bundles work? Are they doable? Are they practical? Are they necessary? And if ever we implement, these are 2 things that is expected from the team members: the commitment and concern. And I love this slide. Remember, wherever we are, we have the power to change. You might be in a bigger hospital, or you might be in a very small hospital. You might be in a corporate, or you might be in a mission hospital, or you might be a nurse educator. You have the power to change. You need to stand apart. You need to do things so that, you'll be able to make the lives of our patients better. And I like the small candle that we have. Wherever we are, we need to bring light to the people around us, who are those who are in darkness. And so I hope that, all of us will be able to brighten that corner wherever we are, whether we are a nurse, we are in the academic side, or on the clinical side, or on the research side. Brighten the corner where you are. And remember, care is our business. Whoever we are, whether we are, teaching in a college, or, working in the clinical side, care is our business. So we have to keep insisting this to our students, to our colleagues, to our juniors. And compassion, competence, communication, courage, and commitment is something very, very important. Where we see these values going down nowadays, please remember, we are there to teach our students, we are there to teach our juniors to make care as our center. So thanks for listening to me. And if you have any questions, keep it to the last of the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deva. Over to Sheila.
Yes, ma'am. I'll stop my video now. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Good afternoon to all of you. It is such a privilege to be here. I thank God for this opportunity. I thank Dr. Rosalind for this opportunity, and to be sandwiched between two icons, Dr. Devakirubai and Joy Kezia. What a privilege it is. Okay, so here I am to bring you a few facts regarding ICU care bundles. And I'm going to be very practical in my approach in what you can actually do in your clinical areas. As Dr. Devakirubai has already taught us, it's a small set of evidence-based interventions which, when implemented together, bring out a better outcome. It is the synergy. One person does something, another person does something, and another person does something. But when three of them do it together, the synergistic effect is so much better than each person doing it individually. That is all about bundles. Now, before I start, I would like to tell you something. There are so many bundles developed by the CDC, it is developed by the IHI, it is developed by AACN, it is developed by ACA. But what is essential is what you can develop for your own clinical area. Very often we try to follow what Westerners have done or others have done in other areas, but try to see what is the need in your particular area of work. We are today dealing with ICU care bundles. What is the need in your ICU? What is the status in your ICU? And go by that. Develop your own bundle, test it the way Dr. Devakirubai so elaborately explained to us. Test it and then formulate it, form a team and implement it. And that will be much more relevant and practical and much more important for the patients rather than us following whatever is given by other institutions. We'll start with ventilator-associated pneumonia. Now, this is a pneumonia that develops after 48 hours or longer after mechanical ventilation. How do we calculate this? There is a formula by which we can calculate the VAP rate. So the number of ventilator-associated pneumonias divided by the number of ventilator days into 1,000, that gives the VAP rates. If your HICC units are giving you the VAP rates, you do not have to worry. How do they calculate this? That is the formula. Now, the incidence of VAP differs in various places, starting from the global, which is 13.9 per 1,000 ventilator days. And in India, it varies. Different studies give different data. It is between 8.9 to 46 per 1,000. Now, I'll straight away go into the risk factors. And one thing you cannot forget, or one thing you need to remember when it comes to ventilator-associated pneumonia, is the word biofilm. What is a biofilm? The biofilm is something which develops within the ET tube and something which is there on the oral cavity of a person. So if you look at this diagram, you can see initially the microorganisms go and attach to the secretions which are present either inside the ET tube or in the oral cavity. And you can see how they grow within these secretions, within the plaque, whatever is present in the oral cavity and within the ET tube. Then they get detached. As they get detached, they grow, they get distributed. You can see, if you can see the oral cavity and if you can see the tooth and you can see the germs over there, and the diagram below, you can see the plaque. Plaque which is left for longer time without removal becomes calculus. And if you look at the small space between the gum and the tooth, you can see how these biofilm with lot of microorganisms are present. So you see these microorganisms get into the lungs, either through the oral cavity and as the patient swallows the saliva, or it enters through the ET tube and it goes right down through the bronchi into the alveoli, and you can see how they enter the alveoli, how they grow and strengthen in the alveoli, and how they calcify. Now, what is the problem with this? The problem is that the alveoli is the most important organ which is necessary for gas exchange. I know many of you are basic students over here who are attending, and for your benefit, I want you to realize that these microorganisms which get right down into the alveoli, if you can look at the diagram here where it is written O2, okay, this is the cross section of the alveoli. You see the microorganisms going and settling right down there. So what happens? It is obstructing, it is causing a barrier between the blood vessel and the alveoli, thereby impairing the gas exchange. And if you can look at the diagram on the right, there is a proper position of ET tube where it should not go beyond the carina. It is supposed to be about more than 2 centimeters above the carina. When it goes beyond that, there is going to be injury on all those sides. And when there is injury on all those sides, any break in integrity is a welcome sight for microorganisms. And here again, you can see because of aspiration, okay, when the patient swallows, of course, saliva keeps getting produced. And if we don't remove it as nurses through oral suctioning, the patient, it slowly seeps down. And if the patient is sedated, without his knowledge, it keeps going down. And when it goes down, it collects above the endotracheal cuff and it is present. And then you can see in this diagram how slowly it is seeping down right into the trachea and the bronchi. And from then it goes down into the alveoli. You can also see the biofilm which is collected inside the ET tube. That also breaks down and gets it. And what happens? You have your healthcare workers' hands, you have the colonized ventilator tubing, maybe you have the biofilm in the ET tube, maybe you may have the oropharyngeal colonized secretions. All of that together get right into all of these contribute towards the microorganisms multiplying within the respiratory system of the patient. Now, to combat this, the WAP care bundle has come in. So this is the typical 5-element care bundle developed by IHA. You have the head of bed elevation, oral care with chlorhexidine, stress ulcer prophylaxis, daily sedation and breathing trial, and deep vein thrombosis. Now, head end elevation is the most important of all of this. What is the recommended head end elevation? It is 30 to 45 degree. Now, why is it so very important? Because when the patient's head end is not elevated, there is a chance for the patient to have aspiration, regurgitation from the GI system. Why? The patient is on mechanical ventilation. There is application of positive pressure. Thereby, there is increase in the intrathoracic cavity, intrathoracic volume. That causes extra pressure onto the abdominal cavity. And so there is a chance for gastric contents to be aspirated. It could also be because of sedation and there's more chance. It could also be because of slow motility. Various factors in the critically ill patient make the patient very susceptible for aspiration. And head end elevation is one important intervention which can take care of all of this. Now you may ask me, how do we know, ma'am, that whether we have had the head end elevated at 30 to 45 degree? You can get something like this. This is a angle indicator. This has a magnetic base. You could fix it at the edge of the bed. If you have this as the head end of the bed, okay, you could attach it here. And as you lift the head end, you can see the angle. As you lift the head end, you can see the angle, okay? And when it comes to 45 degree, you can fix it at that place. So you are sure that it is at 45 degree. Now, one problem with this, that there are many people who come to assess the patient. The physiotherapist comes, puts the head end down, gives physiotherapy and goes away. Meanwhile, you're busy with another patient or loading drug. So you need to be careful that you assess the head end elevation of the patient every 1 hour and document it every 1 hour, making sure that you are maintaining this particular aspect of care. The next most important aspect of care for prevention of ventilator-associated pneumonia is oral care. It's the most important, and we need to be really conscious of this, because the nursing intervention for the patient determines whether the patient develops an infection or not. And the burden of this ventilator-associated pneumonia is huge. So as nurses, we can have a real impact on the care and the prognosis and the outcome of the patient. So main aspects under the oral care are brushing, oral suctioning, chlorhexidine coating, and lip lubrication. So again, if you look at it, you can see a picture of a oral cavity after the ET tube was removed. If you have a coated tongue like this, I can assure you that the patient will definitely have plaque, would definitely have a lot of microorganisms which have gone right in and will continue to make it difficult for the patient. So we have different toothbrushes which will help in removing the plaque from the patient. So we call it as the interdental brush or soft toothbrush. If you do not get anything, even the pediatric brush, you can get the finger brush from the pharmacy. You can give that as a prescription and get it, and you can use that. And in the ICUs, it is better to use a system wherein you will be able to flush while the brushing is going on and also suction at the same time. So it is not possible for you to do this unless there are 4 hands available. So you always need an assistant when you have to give oral care. You can see in this picture, there is one person who is having the suction in one hand and the brush in the other hand. And there is another person who is flushing the system as well as using the spatula to open up the oral cavity for easier access. And the next is chlorhexidine. This is most important. Now, in this, I need to remind you that the sequence in which you give oral care is most important. It is not enough to just take a swab and give oral care with chlorhexidine. Though you use chlorhexidine, it's not going to be helpful. You need to first make sure that you remove the plaque with brushing, and you need to make sure that you have nicely aspirated, and then take the swab and coat the entire oral cavity, including the gums and the tongue, with chlorhexidine. This is an important indicator, and keep the patient's lips lubricated. Okay, and the other area from which patient can develop ventilator-associated pneumonia is the ET tube. So we have usually the mucociliary elevator, which ensures that the secretions keep moving. And because of this, you have the biofilm, which is formed inside the ET tube. So once the ET tube has got the biofilm inside, it stays here. We know that almost, up to this part of it will be inside the patient. Okay, it will be inside the patient. And when biofilm has developed, suppose you're going to instill normal saline. I know that in many areas, many ICUs, they still instill normal saline into the ET tube, believing that it will help in removing all the secretions. Believe me, that's not going to happen. Rather, what is going to happen is the biofilm, which is collected inside the ET tube, is going to be pushed right inside the lungs, because of the normal saline installation that you have done. And that is going to be a definite risk factor for pneumonia. So normal saline is no more recommended for removing the secretions of the patients. Rather than that, we can recommend N-acetylcysteine or something else which will be a mucus thinner and enable the patient to bring out the secretions. Another important item in this respiratory care is the subglottic suction port. So if we have ET tube with the subglottic suction port, it helps in ensuring that the secretions which are collected above the endotracheal cuff are removed. If you can see in this picture, you can see there is the endotracheal cuff and there are secretions that can be collected. You can see the word sputum bacteria. They can be collected in that place and slowly it can seep down. And as it seeps down, it goes right into the alveoli. So we need to be cautious about all of that when it comes to oral care. And do not forget, oral suctioning is the most important part of oral care. Now, the next intervention in the bundle is daily sedation vacation. Why do we need to stop sedation? We know, we just heard that if the patient is sedated, there is more risk of aspiration. So every day, once a day, we will have to stop the sedation and see if it is possible to manage the patient without sedation, except for patients who have head injury, severe sepsis, ARDS, tetanus, and so on. And we need to withhold narcotics at least once a day to see if it is going to help the patient. And when you stop the sedation or when you're withholding narcotics, we need to make sure that the vigilance and monitoring has to be enhanced. So someone has to be near the patient bedside to make sure that the patient does not extubate by self at that time. So we need to be careful as nurses. So we look at the various factors. So if there is colonization of the mouth, we need to make sure that we use chlorhexidine to prevent that. We can ensure that head end elevation is at 45 degrees to prevent microaspiration. We can use subglottic suction, and that is also to prevent microaspiration. And if the ventilator circuits are routinely being changed in your ICU, make sure that it is not changed often, because these changing practices also can lead to increased infection. Always a closed suction system is the best to prevent VAP, and humidified or heat moisture exchangers can be fixed instead of liquid humidifier. So there are various factors. We know what causes VAP. Oral colonization. If it is oral colonization, we use stress ulcer prophylaxis. How does stress ulcer prophylaxis help in oral colonization? Why does a patient get stress ulcer? Because when a patient is critically ill, the blood supply to the stomach is decreased. And when the blood supply is decreased, the mucus, which is produced to protect the stomach, is also decreased and makes it more susceptible to the hydrochloric acid action. So we need to make sure that the patient gets stress ulcer prophylaxis, and the patient also needs to get a prokinetic agent so that the gastric motility is increased. Regular oral care has to be given, and chlorhexidine mouthwash. To reduce aspiration, we need to put the head end up 45 degrees. Regular cuff pressure needs to be checked. Always ensure that the endotracheal cuff pressure is 20 to 25 centimeters of water. That will prevent the leaking and avoid reintubation. To reduce the length of ventilation, every day assess, does the patient really need ventilation? Does the patient really need sedation? And try to wean off from both at the earliest. And all equipment that is used for care needs to be decontaminated appropriately, and ensure that all the infection control mechanisms, especially washing of the hand, is carried on appropriately. So that's the bundle: head end elevation, oral care, sedation, cessation, and breathing trial every day, stress ulcer prophylaxis, and DVT prophylaxis. Moving on to CLABSI. You may have a lot of doubts because our time is very short. I'm going in quickly. You can always send in your questions at the chat and we would try to address it. So CLABSI is a primary bloodstream infection in a patient who has a central line, and if that infection develops within a 48-hour period, before the development of BSI and is not bloodstream related to infection at any other site. So what is the bundle here? It is the hand hygiene, barrier precaution, chlorhexidine skin antiseptic, optimal catheter site selection, and care and review. So you need to be careful in terms of assessing for the risk factor at the time of insertion of the central line and maintenance of the central line, and also prevent CLABSI. So at this time of insertion, it is very essential for one policeman to be there right next to the patient. Why? Because those who are doing the procedure are too involved in that procedure that sometimes they may compromise on the insertion. So we do have a checklist, and there is someone there in our ICU right next and telling, sir, you're going wrong in this, sir, you're doing this. So that will help them to make sure that they come back onto the infection control protocol. So we need to follow aseptic technique, and maximal barrier has to be used. So chlorhexidine again is the recommended barrier that we use to ensure that infection does not develop, and the best insertion site is to be used. So if you all know, the femoral is the last preferred, and the subclavian is the best preferred. And as much as possible, the insertion site has to be planned well ahead. And once the insertion is done, the dressing is to be done with a sterile, transparent, semi-permeable dressing, and not a gauze dressing as much as possible. That is the method by which we can prevent infection. So what are the important things that a nurse should be careful about? Hand hygiene, using chlorhexidine for skin care, and we can use the motto scrub the hub. How do we give injection to a patient? How do we handle the central line when a patient is receiving drugs or infusions? We need to make our own protocol. What we did was very helpful. We made a very specific customized procedure plan. So we said everybody needs to use a sterile glove when they are handling central line, whatever it be, even if it is to just change the bunk, even if it is to put on a Q site, it's all right. We need to use that. So we open up the sterile glove and drop in onto the sterile surface all that is needed, maybe the syringe, the arterial line, the needle, whatever. And we also keep a cotton ball pack, which is having chlorhexidine in it. And we make sure that once we don the gloves, we make sure that the hub, even before we remove the bunk, we use an interface, a sterile gauze interface to handle the central line, so that the sterile glove will not touch the central line which has been exposed so far. So use a sterile interface. With that, we use the gauze as an interface and hold it. And with the chlorhexidine swab, scrub the entire bunk. And after it is scrubbed, only then remove the bunk, if at all the bunk has to be used. And then scrub the bunk again with a second piece of chlorhexidine cotton, and then give the injection or connect the infusion, whatever is to be done. And if it is to be discontinued, scrub again with chlorhexidine and come on. Important thing to remember is you need to wait for the chlorhexidine to dry. So it's going to take a little more time than usual, but it's worth it when it comes to the patient not developing an infection. And if the dressing is wet, soiled, or dislodged, it needs to be changed, and change the administration sets as required. Important thing, check, does the patient require central line at all? When we know that it is a high risk for infection, we need to be very careful. And we also need to be careful when a patient is receiving infusions that the patient at high risk. If the patient is on TPN, the patient is at high risk for infection. How? Suppose I keep a bowl of sugar over here. What will happen after some time? The ants from all over are going to come to the sugar. Same thing with the TPN. It's got high sugars, and all the microorganisms from the atmosphere are attracted to that, and it's a rich soil over there. So we need to make sure that the entire system is scrubbed well with chlorhexidine before we start a patient on TPN. And there should be no other entry port into the TPN bag. If the patient is on TPN, if the patient is on propofol, okay, at these times the infusions have to be changed much faster. Otherwise, the regular infusions can go for about 72 hours. So we have this checklist which will ensure that all the procedure requirements are maintained while the patient is having the central line insertion. So these are just a few pictures to sensitize you to what is the ideal position for insertion of central line and how the space around should be kept. This is not ideal, and the one on the right, it is good to have the entire area to be covered up so that you will be able to have a sterile feel. And another area where as nurses, we contribute towards the patient developing infection is handling of the central line. So if you look at one port, you can see that there is a bunk over there. Every time the nurse removes that bunk, if she is not wearing the sterile glove, even if she's wearing the sterile glove, if she's not maintaining aseptic precautions, she is introducing microorganisms into the bloodstream of the patient. So best is to use something like this, the Q site. Okay? And this Q site allows for a syringe to be fixed into it, and the infusion can be given without compromising on the aseptic procedure. These may be a little costly, but it goes a long way in ensuring that the patient does not develop an infection. And handling of the bunks. Okay? I get worried every time a nurse removes a bunk because I don't want it to go into the hand of the nurse. Okay? When the bunk goes into the hand of the nurse, we know the patient is getting microorganisms. And if you can see the different types of bunks which are available, you can see the white one, you have the inner port just pointing out. Now that, if the nurse takes in her hand, that's it. You're introducing all the microorganisms right into the patient. So we need to look into small details to see how aseptic precaution can be maintained. Now we do hemodynamic monitoring in the ICU, and we have the syringe. Earlier we used to, if you can see on the right side where it's written sampling and flushing, this is the syringe system we used to use. And though we use a sterile glove, whenever we touch the piston of the syringe, there is high chance of introducing microorganisms because you're pushing the piston back into the syringe, thereby pushing the microorganisms which goes right into the bloodstream of the patient. So what was developed in our ICU was this blue sheath that you can see on the right side. This blue sheath covers the entire piston area. So even if you touch the blue sheath, the microorganisms cannot get inside. So we need to see what can be done in our specific areas to change practices. And when we need to aspirate blood for sampling, we need to make sure that a port is available outside, not within the hemodynamic monitoring system. That is another thing that can be done. This is the transparent dressing system. So this is the bundle for CLABSI, hand hygiene, maximum barrier, optimum site, check for necessity, and maintain. Moving on to COTI, it's a urinary tract infection that occurs when the patient has an indwelling urinary catheter within 48 hours of its removal. Here again, insertion, maintenance, and prevention of infection are quite important. It's very important because we see that about 26% of patients with indwelling catheters develop bacteriuria, 24% of them develop catheter-associated UTI, 3% of them develop bacteria, and in the ICU setting, about 3 to 7%. So whenever a patient has a catheter for more than 6 days, we know the patient is at high risk. If it is inserted in any other place other than operating room, usually they say, some of the physicians say, okay, it has been inserted in the casualty, okay, let's remove it and insert another one. Okay, because there are chances where in an environment where asepsis cannot be maintained, the patient can develop an infection. This catheter related, when the catheter is used for measuring the urine output, and if it's not positioned correctly, and if the closed drainage system is not maintained properly, the patient can develop infection. So proper anchoring of the catheter is important. Maintaining level of the urinary drainage bag is important. Appropriate stand for the drainage bag is important. You need to choose the drainage bag. Avoid kinking and twisting, and see if the patient needs to be on long-term catheter, the silicone catheter. So what is the Cotty bundle, hand washing, avoid unnecessary urinary catheter, insert urinary catheter using aseptic technique, maintain catheters based on guidelines, review every day. Does the patient really need a urinary catheter? He does not, remove it. Let's not give a chance for infection to develop. And earlier, always betadine used to be the solution of choice for perineal care. Now we encourage the patient to wash the perineal area just like wash when a bath is being given. So that wash is supposed to be good for prevention of urinary catheter infection. And always maintain an unobstructed flow free from thinking. And we also have this habit where you use one container and go around emptying urine for many patients. Now that also needs to stop. Each patient needs to have a separate collection container. So that is the Cotty bundle. Where hand hygiene again, insertion practice, the position or anchoring practice, the necessity for urinary catheter to be checked, and maintenance. So what is it to be done? What is the strategy for nurses? Get the stories, okay, what is going wrong? As Dr. Deva has already told us, get to the field, get the facts, get together, get a clock. That means set a timeline, get the numbers, get statistics, get goals, and then get bold. So we need to remember when we are talking about infection in the ICU care bundles are all for prevention, mostly for prevention of infection. The germ is nothing. This is what Louis Pasteur said. It is the terrain in which it grows, which is everything. Let's remember that in our battle against the bug. Let us assess, evaluate, plan, implement, and develop. And finally, I want to leave you with this one thought from Admiral Hyman Rickover. Good ideas are not adopted automatically. They must be driven into practice with courageous patience. May the Lord help each one of us to courageously practice what we have learned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheila, for that wonderful presentation. Over to Joy. Then we'll participants, if you have any questions, kindly leave it in the chat box. The experts will answer it for you. Over to Joy.
Ma'am, am I audible?
Yes, yes, Joy.
Yeah.
Welcome, Joy.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. While the screen is getting shared, I take this opportunity, ma'am, to thank you for this wonderful session that you have actually set for us. I must tell all of you who are attending, around 400 plus participants, I know it is not a good time for having, a very detailed medical surgical class, but I must place on record that Rachel ma'am has this rare, unique capacity to keep people awake, and all her sessions wherein I have been her student has been between 2 to 4, and the way ma'am takes classes, I have never slept. And if there are people who sleep, I tell ma'am often, ma'am will throw small bits of chalk piece on us, and I still cherish the notes that I've taken from Rachel ma'am, also from Devakirbai ma'am, and also from Sheila ma'am. So I'm actually a very small little person trying to present something today. And what I always say, teachers know what, where or what their students have to improve upon. So probably Rachel ma'am thought I should be doing the sepsis bundles and SSI bundles. So it was a lot of learning for me also in the past 1 week. Why I had to learn was because, we had lost touch with this COVID pandemic, and it was a COVID bundle that all of us have been talking about. The whole world is about entry to exit of COVID, and then employee COVID, non-employee COVID. So it has been, a very different thought process. And thank you very much, ma'am, for this beautiful session. Shobha, are you able to share the screen?
Ma'am, I have shared it, ma'am. Is it visible, ma'am?
No, no, dear.
No.
I have shared it, ma'am. Once again, I'll try. Ma'am, is it visible now, ma'am?
No, not yet.
Ma'am, share Pandita.
Stop sharing. Then go back to the share screen.
Yeah, sepsis bundle.
முதல்ல ஸ்லைட் ஷோல போட்டு அவர் ஷேர் பண்ணி பாருங்க.
Stop sharing.
Stop.
இல்ல இல்ல இது வந்துருச்சுனால ஸ்டாப்.
Resume share கொடுத்து
This is visible, Joy?
No. Actually, can you see my screen, ma'am? I'm also sharing. Is it visible?
No, no. Okay, maybe both of us are doing it. I'll stop share. You just check.
Yeah, because
Varna?
is it visible?
No, no.
Yeah, it's come.
Yeah, okay. Fine.
You just have to move to the first slide, dear.
First plate.
Right. So, ma'am, is it clear? Can I start?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay. Right. So, I will be doing couple of bundles on surgical care. Next. Right. Okay. So we've learned from Dr. Devakirubai and from Dr. Sheila what we've been learning about bundle. Bundle is just a structured way of improving the processes of care and patient outcomes. It is a small, straightforward set of evidence-based practices, generally 3 to 5, that when performed collectively and reliably, you can prove that it improves patient outcomes. Shobha, can you please mute your mic? Right, yeah, thank you. So like what we were actually discussing, a bundle need not be actually copied and pasted from some other person or some other, university or some other PDF or SOP. We create our own bundles so that, our nurses right there inside the ICU are actually able to perform this particular care. So now coming to these two bundles, which are extremely useful for ICU nurses. Now what Sheila ma'am had dealt with was VAP and CLABSI. So many nurses love to work in the ICUs. They love ICU because of the experience, because you consider yourself to be more competent. Now, when this is coming to others, now there are two or more bundles that you can actually get to hear of from today. And once you graduate and place yourself into being a staff nurse, please remember that all of these things that you're actually learning today is going to be extremely practical and useful for you. I understand we are running out of time, but then it is going to be very short. And I brought in a few mnemonics that you can actually remember and practice while you're working inside your ICU. So going on to the first one, which is SSI bundle, surgical site infection prevention bundle. And number 2 is sepsis bundle. This again is sepsis prevention bundle. Next slide. Right. So the bundle components for SSI, it, on an overall platform, it involves a lot of mitigation of risk factors, how to do glycemic control, how to maintain normothermia, antibiotic prophylaxis, and patient education. Next. I have divided the SSI package into a few slides. Just to give you a little bit of understanding. Now you all understand SSI is typically for patients who have undergone a surgery. It is not for medical cases, right? Now coming to surgical patients, when you have an incision, let it be a small to a large, major, deep, superficial, whatever, the maximum number of infections that have been reported have been Staphylococcus aureus or Staphylococcus epidermis. And 25% to 50% they show methicillin resistance through Staphylococcus aureus isolates. In the Indian subcontinent especially, we should be aware of this because we work here, and we should be aware that we always have SSIs wherein the highest prevalence is for gram-negative bacilli, Klebsiella species, E. coli, Pseudomonas, which are significant pathogens, including for the clean surgeries that are being performed. Next. So a few risk factors you might understand. Why I am teaching the risk factors here is because if I'm a nurse and if my patient is posted for surgery tomorrow, please keep these few points in mind so that, you know, when the patient comes back after surgery, this particular patient who falls in one of the brackets for risk factors might develop a surgical site infection later. Age here, anybody up to age 65 is at a risk for SSI, which means, you know, SSI does not spare anybody. So it can happen anytime. And a recent radiotherapy, if your patient has had recent radiotherapy, why? Because they are immunocompromised, and a history of skin or soft tissue infections that are possible, uncontrolled diabetes, obesity, malnutrition, current smoking, immunosuppression, and a preoperative albumin which is very low, which is less than 3.5 milligrams per deciliter, and a total bilirubin of more than 1, perioperative hospital stay of at least 2 days. And all of these can be contributing risk factors in SSI. Next. Right, so perioperative risk factors is now when they just get into the you know, they are posted for the surgery and now they're moving into the surgical area. What would you want them to do? So a few things here again, I've put them into different buckets. So procedure related risk factors are emergency and complex. Now there is a, you know, typical case of a road traffic accident. The patient comes to you with fractured limbs. So that becomes emergency. You do not have time to collect history. Or it could be a complex neurosurgery for an RT, or a complex neurosurgery for stroke, or for, let's say, you know, a clot removal or a tumor, or a higher wound classification, and it includes an open surgery. So these are the buckets which, you know, these are the components inside the procedure related risk factors. Then we have facility related risk factors, which include, you know, the rate of ventilation which is there inside the OT, increased operation theater traffic, you know, movement of people in and out, movement of trolleys in and out, movement of bins in and out the theater, and inappropriate or inadequate sterilization of instruments or equipment. Then we do have patient related factors also, wherein the patient is already having a pre-existing infection and inadequate skin preparation or preoperative shaving. Next. Coming to the intraoperative risk factors, now this is where the patient has been moved into the OT. So it is a long operating time. Let's say a long is anywhere beyond 45 minutes, up to 45 minutes. Yes, it's a minor case. It is easy. Patient comes out in an hour's time. Attendants are happy. Patient is fine. But if it is a long operating time, this again is an intraoperative risk factor. And any sort of blood transfusions, many journals and citations tell us that, you know, blood transfusions, even 1 pint of transfusion has a high risk of, you know, infection transmission to the patient. So as much as possible, we make sure that the patient's hemoglobin status is stabilized even before the patient is taken to the table. But if the patient's clinical condition deteriorates on the table or post-operatively, yes, we will go ahead with blood transfusion. Strict asepsis, surgical technique, poor hand hygiene, hypoxia, hypothermia, and poor glycemic control. All of these are definitive risk factors during your intraoperative phase. The next one. Post-operative risk factors. So now you remember the patient has completed surgery and has moved into your post-operative ward or into the surgical intensive care. So here the patient, in case the patient is already a hyperglycemic patient or an uncontrolled diabetic patient, already with wound care issues, again here I need to tell you that blood transfusion, and studies do show that a single unit of transfusion in the immediate post-operative period is an absolute risk factor for SSI, and the closure technique of the surgical site. All of these play a very important role in post-operative risk. So for closure technique today, lots of things have evolved inside theater. We no longer use sutures, we moved into staples, and wherever it is required, we make minimum keyhole surgeries possible. Next. Right, now to understand SSI in a better way, before we move into the bundle, which is just one slide bundle that you're going to take as your takeaway message. So I just want you to go through this little picture that is here in front of you. So you have the superficial incision or the superficial SSI, where we say it is 0 to 30 days. So if the patient has had surgery today is your 0 day of surgery, and up to 1 month, if the patient has a purulent discharge, pain, swelling, redness around the incisional area, all of that will be classified under SSI, superficial SSI. Then you have deep soft tissue, which involves fascia and the muscle, which is defined as the deep incisional SSI. And you also have the organ or space related SSI, which is more deeper than the deep incisional SSI. So these are the three classifications under SSI. Next. Right. All this is too much of a theory. I do not want you to please read it at all. I will just tell you what the important points are here. So SSI superficial, I told you infection occurs within 30 days. So 0 to 30 days, just remember that. So how will the patient manifest? How will the patient tell you that I've had a particular infection? There will be a purulent discharge from the superficial incision. It can be just watery discharge. It can just wet the gown that you're wearing. Sometimes after patient has been discharged and sent home after spinal surgeries, you realize the patient comes back telling there was something oozing. So it is not sticky, it is not smelly. You don't even actually have to do even a culture, but you please remember that this is a straight case of superficial SSI. And the other signs are pain, tenderness, localized swelling, redness, heat, and things like this. These are all part of superficial SSI. Next. So types here again, superficial, here we call both superficial and deep SSI. Both have something called primary and secondary. Primary is when the infection is in a localized area or in the first or the prime area of surgery. And in secondary incision, in where the operation has more than one incision. So that is about SIP and SIS. SIP is superficial incisional primary, a superficial incisional SSI that is identified in a primary incision in a patient who has had an operation with one or more incisions, like for example, C-section or chest incision for coronary artery bypass graft with the donor site. Whereas an SIS, which is superficial incisional secondary, a superficial incisional SSI that is identified in the secondary incision in a patient who has had more than one incision. Okay, so these are types of superficial SSIs. Next. So deep here again, now superficial was 0 to 30 days. Deep becomes beyond 30 days and up to a place of 1 year in the case of an implant surgery. So here again, how do they manifest? They manifest with purulent discharges. Deep incision spontaneously, dehiscizes, and deliberately it is opened by the surgeon, and culture positive. It may not be cultured, and the patient has had spikes of, fevers. It is localized. Patient has pain. It is tender, and there is an abscess which needs to be drained, which needs histopathological evidences or radiological examination, and definitely the surgeon will want to do a reopening or a redressing at this particular site. Next. Here again, like we discussed for superficial, here again it is DIP and DIS, like we said SIP and SIS. So a deep incisional SSI that is identified in a primary incision in a patient who has had operation with one or more incisions, and here again who has had an operation with more than one incision at the same donor site. Okay, so this is about the types of deep SSIs. Next. So organs or space SSI definition, how do we define this? It involves any part of the body excluding skin incision, fascia or muscle layers that is opened or manipulated during the operative procedure. Specific sites are assigned to organ or space SSI to identify further location of the infection. So this exactly happens when you start off the surgery at one point or one particular location in the abdomen, and then you realize the infection is leading to another organ and you need to open up that particular location. So the specific site is assigned to the organ or the space, and from there we further locate the site of the infection. Next. Right, now the little bit of bundle that you just have to take care, it's you know, basically a lot of common sense that the nurse really needs to work with. 7S bundle is the most easy that you can carry home with you. So safety, is your operating room safe? Screen, are you screening for risk factors and presence of MRSA and MSSA? Showers, have you had your patients to cleanse their body in the night before and in the morning of the surgery with chlorhexidine? Skin preparation, has it been done with iodophor based, or if it is chlorhexidine based, it's still even better. Solutions, are you irrigating the tissues prior to closure or remove exogenous contaminants? And we have sutures, are you closing tissues with antimicrobial sutures? And skin closure, are you sealing the incision or covering it with an antimicrobial dressing to prevent exogenous contamination? So this is just a safety checklist that you can have. Make sure all the 7S has been done, and you prevent your patient from entering an SSI. Next. So this is your take-home message for SSI prevention. Pre-operatively what you can do, intraoperatively what you can do, and post-operatively what you can do. Most of these guidelines I have taken from CDC, WHO, so they are reliable, and whatever, you know, we are practicing currently in almost all our hospitals. So first, yes, pre-operative bath, 2 are advisable, so 1 in the night and 1 in the morning, or 1 is definitely recommended. Second is mechanical bowel preparation along with oral or IV antibiotics that is started, and hair removal or clipping, intranasal mupirocin for certain patients who have already had Staphylococcus aureus issues, and alcohol-based hand rub, hand hygiene, skin antiseptics, surgical prophylaxis with antibiotics, good nutrition, and a glycemic control wherein you have your HbA1c at lesser than 8%, or you maintain glycemic control between 140 to 200 mg per dl. Intraoperative phase, please ensure OT traffic is minimal, maintain patient's normal temperature, normal volemia, you know, in a patient that does have enough of volumes to circulate so that the patient does not lose fluids. Irrigation of the wound, antimicrobial impregnated sutures, iodine impregnated drapes. Post-operatively, we'll move to wound care, dressing. Yeah, vancomycin powders, not all of us do use it, and vancomycin powders are not recommended for any of the spinal surgeries. So vancomycin powders 2 grams is actually put right into the suture site, surgical site itself, and then it is closed. So these are the best practices or the recent practices that have evolved, which hospitals have adapted. In coming to post-operative care, you know, aseptic wound care is the only one take-home bundle here. Make sure your patient has absolutely no infection from the hands that are providing dressing. Vacuum dressing can be done, negative pressure dressing can be done, and if it's a burns dressing, yes, definitely a silver-based dressing material can be used. Next. Right. So this is another, take-home little mnemonic that you can have in bundles of care for SSI. I told you about the 7S. Then I told you about intraoperative and post-operative bundle. And very, very easily for you to remember, it's CATS: clippers, antibiotics, temperature, and sugar control. Even if you don't remember anything, just make sure that clippers, antibiotics, temperature, and sugar control are done for your patient. This is more than enough to keep your patient safe. Next. Right. So whatever we have studied, if you are working in your hospital and if you are in a position to create documents, you can make your own document like the one that I'm showing you here. Like this is the check sheet that we use for SSI prevention bundle. So, all of the topics that I have told you just now are, printed into a small sheet wherein the assigned nurse just has to go through this and make sure that she has done everything. Has the patient stopped smoking? Pre-op chlorhexidine cleanse done, glycemic control done, hair removal done. So all of these are, it is just a small little checklist that the patient, that the nurse can use to ensure that your patient is really, really safe. Okay, so whenever I talk about SSI, I always tell your patient does not come here to buy one and get one free. Your patient has come here just for a particular surgery, and please remember that the patient undergoes this particular surgery absolutely, in a way that he or she is comfortable, and the patient does not take infection as a free gift and walk out. It is not fair on our part. It is not ethical for us to, gift infection to a patient who has come in healthy. Next. Right. So now these are now we are moving on to sepsis care bundles. Now under sepsis care bundles, it is sepsis resuscitation bundles, which is I'm classifying, we will classify them as 3 hours and 6 hour bundles. And we have a sepsis management bundle. These are really very, very easy, and I'm sure all of you are doing it in your ICUs, so it is not big rocket science at all. So when you realize SSI can easily, cascade into sepsis if infection is not taken care of in the initial stages. So please remember, I am segregating it into a resuscitation mode and into a management mode. When do you say you want to resuscitate a patient? Let's say when you call for a code blue, you are resuscitating a patient. You're doing CPR. Okay. So when you're doing this particular CPR, what happens is that you are actually resuscitating a patient and you're trying to get the patient back to life. Now, this is exactly what we're going to be doing in sepsis resuscitation also. Next slide. Right, in sepsis, so before we go to resuscitation, look at what I have posted there. SEPSIS. I think you can read it vertically down. S stands for slurred speech or confusion. E stands for extreme shivering or muscle pain and fever. Passing no urine at all. Severe breathlessness. It feels like you're going to die. Skin is mottled or discolored. So hope you've got SEPSIS. So this is a small little mnemonic that you can by heart and keep in your mind. How do you recognize your patient is going into sepsis? Patient is not talking correctly. Patient is confused. Patient is having extreme shivering, fever or pain. Passing no urine or very minimal urine throughout the day. Severe breathlessness. Feels like you're going to die, and skin is mottled. So these are the expressions or the mnemonics that I have created for sepsis. Next slide. Right. This is just a little picture. I will share this presentation with Rachel ma'am, and whoever wants it, you can have it. So what are the risk factors that can predispose a particular patient to sepsis? Next. Right. So we start with SIRS. It moves to sepsis, severe sepsis, and septic shock. So SIRS is systemic inflammatory response syndrome. So when your system is actually getting inflamed, when your own system is getting inflamed, a particular response syndrome is being created in your body. And how does the body react to it? It reacts by throwing spikes of temperatures. Your respiratory rate goes up, your heart rate goes up, your counts are erratically high, and your PCO2 starts falling down. And the first stage of sepsis, where SIRS is confirmed, plus it is confirmed with a suspected site of infection. Third stage goes to severe sepsis, where you can see end stage organ damage into play, and your lactate levels are constantly starting to rise, where it is more than 4 millimoles. And in septic shock, you realize the patient has gone into a shock syndrome, and this is the cascading features of sepsis that you will really have to understand. Next. Right. So 1 hour bundle is pure, pure common sense for a nurse who works inside ICU. Of course, we do not write the antibiotic dosages, or we do not write the ventilatory dosages for our patients. But please realize that when your patient has come into your ICU or come into your ER, if you're working in an ER as an emergency trauma nurse, please realize that the patient comes in with the signs and symptoms that I've told you for SEP, SIS, sepsis. So your patient has temperature, patient is tachyc, patient is not talking, skin is mottled, there is no urine output, patient's skin feels warm. So you realize that your patient has already come in with good amount of sepsis, and all that you need to immediately do is immediately take your blood culture before you can start your antibiotic. Very often this particular mistake is done by nurses, wherein the doctor tells antibiotic and the first dose of antibiotic is administered, and then somebody realizes we've not taken a culture still. Okay, so please verbalize, ask your clinician, can we go ahead and do the culture before we start the antibiotic? And then you measure lactate levels, because lactate levels is going to help us understand in which stage of sepsis our patient is. And you begin to rapidly administer 30 ml per kilograms of crystalloid, just to make sure that the patient does not fall with less BP or go into hypotension. Next. Right, now coming to the 3-hour bundle, I told you the resuscitation bundle. Under the resuscitation bundle, we have 1 hour bundle, 3 hours bundle, and the 6 hours bundle. So all of these bundles, again, these are just big terminologies. Just don't be, worried about this at all. You just need to do what, your ICU protocols are, and most of the good hospitals will definitely be following these bundles. So I will tell you the 3-hour bundle next. Right, in the 3-hour care bundle, there are just 3 points. Just make sure your blood cultures are sent before you start antibiotics, obtain a lactic level, and administer antibiotics and administer crystalloids. So just 3 points which are the same as your 1-hour bundle. But why we also classify them for 3 hours is that you require this 3 hours for your patient to settle, make sure your patient has a bit of oxygen, make sure your patient's ventilation status is stabilized. So this is about the 1 and 3 hour bundles. Next slide. Yeah, this is about the 6-hour bundles, and here we go into vasopressors, because in case the patient has gone into hypotension, you might have to give vasopressors to resuscitate your patient. Please realize you maintain a mean arterial pressure which is greater than or equal to 65 mmHg, and you must achieve a CVP of more than 8 mmHg. And a nurse's responsibility here is, once an arterial line has been placed, Sheila ma'am has taken us very, very detailed through how to place an arterial line. So once an arterial line has been placed, why do we place it? We place it right here for all of this, that we need to be doing this assessment and monitoring. So when me as a nurse, I'm standing there here in this particular ICU, make sure when your CVP is falling below 8, please alert your clinician team. Please tell them that the patient is falling, and you make sure that the CVP does not fall lesser than this 8 mmHg. And you achieve a central venous oxygen saturation of more than 70, or a mixed venous oxygen saturation, which is SVO2, which is greater than 65. And continue to monitor serum lactate. Next. Right, so then continuation of broad spectrum antibiotics, which is started within 1 hour, 3 hours, and then you can de-escalate it depending on the conditions that the patient is, showing forth. Then treat hypotension. In the event of persistent hypertension, despite fluid resuscitation, you realize that the patient has gone into a septic shock syndrome or a lactate of more than 4, then you continue your ventilation for the patient. Next. So coming to the management bundle, we are now we have completed with the resuscitation bundle. So I spoke about sepsis resuscitation bundle, I spoke about 1 hour bundle, I spoke about 3 hours bundle, and I spoke about the 6 hours bundle. Now coming to the management bundle is, it's not a big difference. All that you need to do is just add 2 more things to your bundle, which is low dose of steroids and recombinant human activated proteins that we start giving for the particular patient. Why? Because you want the patients to be healthy and active, so you start giving a low dose steroids to control the inflammatory process which is inside their body, and you also want to give them an activated protein C, which is helpful for a patient who is actually going into sepsis. And you continue to do whatever else that you have been doing in your 3 hour and in your 6 hours bundle. Next. Yeah, so nursing care here, I have just written the same things again in small points. So we can skip all of this. Go next. Next. Yeah, so here, yeah, right. So this, I think this is my last slide. So here, sepsis protocol in one shot for all of you. So within 3 hours, what we do, within 6 hours, what we do here again. So please, this is your take home message for a sepsis protocol. So within 3 hours, obtain lactic acids, blood cultures before antibiotics. Do not delay antibiotics if you're unable to obtain blood cultures. Please give antibiotics within 1 hour of identification, and fluid resuscitation minimum of 30 ml per kg body weight. Consult sepsis coordinator in Meditech is, of course, this is because I've taken it as a picture from the web, but consult your sepsis coordinator. Yes, we do have infection control coordinators here, so you can contact your doctors to tell them, give them the background of your patient. Repeat lactic acid, because once you start your antibiotics and the other measurements, the measures for your patient, lactic acid must start falling down. So that is why we say we keep repeating lactic acids, and start vasopressors if hypotension is not responding. Coming to the 6-hour package, yes, in 6 hours, you continue to do the focused examination, which is documented by MD, PA, or a nurse professional, and you want to review temperature, heart rate, respiratory rate, and BP. Cardiopulmonary examination every 2 hourly for these sort of patients are extremely important. Go ahead with peripheral pulse evaluation, skin examination, and capillary refill exam, and or following documented. And of course, I've told you the goal for SpCO2 should be more than 70%. If required, if there are cardiovascular symptoms, go for an echo, and make sure passive exercises for the leg is continued, and also maintain the patient on a little bit of head end elevation. So this completes the sepsis protocol. So on a recap, I think we have actually done SSI bundle, wherein in SSI I have taught you superficial, deep, and organ or space. And in sepsis protocol, I have taught you first hour, 3 hours, and 6 hours protocol. So I think this is all from my end. And if you have questions, kindly do post it across to me, and I will share this presentation with Rachel ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy, for that wonderful presentation. There are 2 questions. May I request Dr. Irene Light to come on to the picture, please? Those 2 questions are from ma'am. I want to see ma'am, because an active service side person, a lively person. So, ma'am, please come up. Ma'am quietly is asking questions. Okay, the questions are closed suctioning, the procedure for closed suctioning, ma'am wants to know that, and the nasal smear for MRSA. How do you go about? Ma'am needs a little explanation. Ma'am, Irene, ma'am, we're not going to leave you. You don't come all the way to Chennai to present. So now we want to see you in this platform. Over to Joy.
Ma'am, about her suctioning.
Suctioning, closed suctioning.
Yes, closed suctioning kits are available from many vendors today.
Okay.
So along with the closed suction, see, basically closed suctioning is that it all comes in the same tube, ma'am. So the same tube that goes into the patient can also, it has a bifurcation, like how we have in IV, it's a Y connector. It is just a connector which is all part of the same closed system. So we don't actually open anything else extra to do this particular suctioning. It comes within a little transparent white cover, and the tube is right there. And whenever the nurse wants to suction, all that she needs to do, it's just a button control. So when she wants to suction suction, she'll just have to use it, suck the patient out, and then discard it, and it goes right into the drain system. So there is no extra catheter that I'm opening. There is no extra solution or sterile water where I have to dip my suction catheter and remove. Like what we used to practice, we used to first open an NG catheter and then keep it inside a tray, and then the tray has to be clean. The tip should not touch anywhere. The tip used to be out in open air. Now none of this is required. It is sold as a set completely. Only thing, it is a little bit of cost to a patient. So we try to minimize number of times that we suction, so that the physiotherapist, the nurse, the doctor, all of us attend on the patient at the same time, so that the chest physio can be given, and then the chest is in a state where the suctioning can be done and the closed suctioning can be used for the patient. Also, kits are available where Sheila ma'am was telling, kits are available where a mechanical brush is also attached to the same tube itself. The brush comes with, like how, newborn babies, when they turn one and they have just one teeth, we use small finger brushes with just small, very soft bristles. The same brush is attached to the tip of the endotracheal suction. So if you can't suction and if you want to actually use the brush, all you need to do is to turn on to the brush side of it, and then you can use it for a patient, remove it, keep it inside its cover, and you can keep it for the patient. So it is indented separately for a particular patient, used for a particular patient, and it is discarded just like that.
Thank you, Joy. Ma'am, Irene ma'am, hope your question is answered. One more question from ma'am is nasal smear for MRSA screening. Ma'am wants to know how a nasal smear for MRSA has been done.
Ma'am, I really do not know actually. For
Maybe we'll
nasal
have-
smear for MRSA, maybe I
Swab,
can
the
take
same
help
thing
from.
as a swab, how we collect for things.
No, it is the same like how we are collecting for COVID, but how it
Same
goes,
thing.
where it goes is, I really have no idea.
Microbiology. Okay.
Yes, it goes to microbiology, but then it is
But what
taken
is a
in.
ma'am, Irene ma'am?
Yeah, Rachel, I just want
Yes.
to know about this. Yeah, because we are taking this swab for two reasons. One is for the implant patients, and then for the both patients. And I wanted to know because many times we may not wait for the MRSA result to come. In that case, we just apply the mupirocin ointment in the
Yes,
nose and the axilla and all.
yes.
So just want to know the real ideal one of it, how to go about it.
Ma'am, ideal is mupirocin 2%, ma'am.
Yeah.
That is the most ideal. So if you are
Okay.
suspecting a major surgery or an implant surgery, absolutely nothing wrong in giving one dose of mupirocin at all.
Okay.
But the swab
So
taking
that
is
is
very,
enough,
very.
correct?
Yes, ma'am. In fact, it is actually very good because sometimes what happens is the nasal residue from here does fall into the oral cavity. So mupirocin actually helps as a very good mechanism to prevent this organism from traveling into the oral cavity.
Okay. That is where I wanted to know. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Whereas the testing is
excellent
as
presentation.
similar. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah,
But the swab taking and the culture media is all very similar to our RT-PCR that we are currently doing. It is the same sort of a test tube. It is the same swab, same cotton-based tip, and it is taken and it is put into the test tube and sent. It takes about 24 hours for the report to come back to us.
Yes.
So generally, meanwhile,
Because when it comes to port, we cannot wait for the result.
yes.
So on the theater, we used to apply to the axilla and groin.
Correct.
And so I want to know whether it is the correct one what we are following in our hospital.
Yes, ma'am. Nasal is a very good mode of practice. There are a few journals that have cited that it is very good, but that alone does not do good. But of course, you would have definitely combined it with some oral or IV antibiotic.
Thank you, ma'am, for coming on online, so we are
Thank
able
you.
to see you.
Right. Thank you so much. ma'am.
Thank you.
My
That's
teacher
very
who
nice.
always loves to learn. That's
I know.
something I like in Irene ma'am. She never thinks any time one small doubt ma'am calls. Why I want you to come up is there are so many youngsters who feel that, they have learned everything. So learning is from womb to tomb. I've learned that from you. Thank you, ma'am, for coming up, and Joy for clarifying the doubt. Hepzibah
Thank
had
you,
wanted to say something. Welcome, Hepzibah from UK. You wanted to say something?
Thank you so much, ma'am. Good morning, or actually good afternoon to all of you. It's really a great pleasure to see Dr. Rosalind and Irene, ma'am. Both of them I have met. I've visited your institutions, and it's such a great pleasure to see Joy, and like being a CMC graduate, and also very special pleasure to say huge thank you to Deva and Sheila, because we are all batchmates. We're all batch of 96. So thank you so much for everything. Very lovely presentation, and thank you for organizing, ma'am. While Joy was explaining about the closed suctioning, I just wanted to add on a little bit, because in UK we have actually made it mandatory for all our patients, especially with this pandemic and COVID thing, because it prevents to some extent the aerosol, the spread of the secretion. So it's now, there is no open suctioning in UK at all in all the ITUs, and it comes along with the SED, as Joy was explaining. And as a nurse, all you have to do is it's like use your thumb to press, and it actually, how we flush and tube, and we don't take out anything. The entire set would be discarded, and it's mandatory for all the patients to be on that. And we don't practice any open suctioning, especially in this COVID situation, to prevent aerosol. And then again, just a little bit more on MRSA swab. I mean, you've explained everything, but again, in UK, we keep it mandatory for all the patients who come. If they're coming to theaters, we actually take them for a pre-assessment, and we do MRSA swab. And we start the treatment, the MRSA protocol very early ahead, so that they have octanthen washes, and we prepare them early if they're coming into surgery. But for all the healthcare professionals, for example, if my daughter goes into hospital, she has to have an MRSA swab, because I'm a healthcare practitioner. So all people who are involved with healthcare practitioners and who are staying in the same residence, it's a mandatory protocol we follow, MRSA swabs. And we don't wait for the results. We go ahead with our treatments, and when the results come, but if they are in high risk, we start them with the washes. So we give this antibiotic body wash, but we don't wait for the results. But once the results are confirmed, we go to the second stage of the protocol, starting them on treatment. But once they are high risk, like for example, healthcare professionals, any past MRSA, any other contact, we start them on treatment, just with the body wash and all that. But then the second stage and all comes back after the results. Thank you so much, ma'am, and thanks for all listening.
It is a wonderful explanation. Thank you, Epsi.
Even here in many hospitals, including Madras Medical Mission, MRSA is mandate when students, being a cardiac unit, we have made it mandate that the new students even get themselves tested, because they go into the clinical area for practice. So it's a mandate so that we don't infect our patients when we go for care. Okay, so any other questions? You're running. It's a big topic. Actually, it should be a 2-day conference actually. So we have covered a huge portion in a short period of time, because being a webinar, attention and connectivity is an issue. So thank you, the speakers, Dr. Devakribai, for that excellent presentation, which was crystal clear why ICU care bundles. She made it very clear there. And Sheila and Joy for doing all the ICU care bundles, though it was, very clear, though it was in a short period of time, everything was completely covered. I hope for all the participants, we reached up to 487 participants today, and then it kept dropping and coming in. So I'm sure each one of you who were here were able to get a lot of knowledge from here. So it's not only knowledge, it's more of practice. So we need to be cautious about what we have learned, so that our patients get the right care. Okay, no shortcuts. So that's very important. And from every ICU to ICU, it will keep varying, because according to our own setup, we have our protocols. Follow protocols. It's for a better patient outcome. Thank you so much, Dr. Devakribai. Sheila had to leave due to her duty because she's in charge of a surgical ICU. And I'm sure Joy is on duty. She needs to also join the patient care. Thank you, all the three resource persons, for that wonderful presentation with so much of dedication in your presentation. Thank you so much. Over to Shobha for a formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. A warm good evening to one and all joined with us today through this online platform. No duty is more urgent than that of returning thanks. First and foremost, I thank the Lord Almighty for his unfailing support and constant control throughout the webinar, especially on the technological control. With a word of thanks to our God Almighty, on behalf of MMM College of Nursing, I take this honor to propose the vote of thanks. I now take this opportunity to record a special thanks to our speakers of today's webinar, Dr. E. Devakribai, HOD, Nursing Foundation, Sacred Heart Nursing College, Madurai, Professor Sheila Thurai, Professor and Nurse Manager, College of Nursing, MMC, Vellore, and Mrs. Joy Kessia ma'am, Chief Nursing Officer, Fortis Mala Hospital, Chennai. I sincerely thank the resource persons for their wonderful and lively presentation. Ma'am, you have accepted our invitation and given your time for us in spite of your busy schedule. Thank you, madams. On behalf of MMM College of Nursing, we would like to provide the certificate of appreciation to all our resource persons. Thank you, madam. Thank you, madam. I express my heartfelt thanks to our principal, Dr. Rosalyn Rachel, who had keen interest on the topic and has taken enormous effort in organizing today's webinar. Thank you, ma'am. I now express my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Lata, Vice Principal, MMM College of Nursing, for her constant support in the happening of today's webinar. Thank you, ma'am. I extend my sincere thanks to the principals, faculty, staffs, and students from various institutions for their participation in this webinar. I hope you enjoyed today's session. I thank each and everyone joined with us today. I'm grateful to all the faculty and non-teaching staff of MMM College of Nursing for their enormous cooperation and for the enormous effort taken for this webinar to make it a successful one. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Shobha. I thank each and every one of you who are present. Those of you who have not filled your feedback, kindly fill it. I leave it open for a few more minutes. And if you want your PowerPoints, kindly leave your mail ID so that we will send it across to you. Thank you for your patient listening, though we have exceeded in our time, but it was a useful one. Thank you so much.